There is so much to what constitutes motivation and what drives people, whether they know it or not, and whether it's just a feeling on a metaphysical level or something more tangible. So much so that it is difficult to define. But here is some valuable insight, and hopefully you find it engaging. A main area of personal interest for me, in this respect, is the metaphysics of the motivation we feel, why we feel it, and how to better understand and harness it. Throughout history and culture, there are numerous examples of art, literature, and philosophy that relate to this and search for the same answer to the question, what is the innate feeling that drives us to develop ourselves further, drives us to explore the unexplored, and drives us to achieve success? The first core concept that is needed for motivation that we will explore in this video comes from the ancient Greek concept of thumos, which is defined as spiritedness, and often described as the fire in the belly that one feels. This is our sense of urgency and is a trait that needs to be felt, identified, and channeled by a person before they can feel any real sense of direction. Particularly prominent in men, this is synonymous with competitive ambition and the burning desire for recognition. It is a very powerful, energetic feeling. Thus, an argument could be made that the contentious modern idea of toxic masculinity is rather just the sense of a man's misused or misdirected thumos, much like an unbridled wild stallion that must be properly tamed and trained in order to realize its awesome potential. It makes sense why Ferrari has a horse as its logo, quite possibly in partial reference to the impressive finesse, speed, and power that such an animal can possess at full gallop. The second concept of the metaphysics of motivation that will be presented today is the Faustian spirit. If you've watched any previous videos on this channel, you will know that this notion has already been mentioned, just not yet in the detail that it will be here. As the name suggests, the Faustian spirit is derived from the folktale Faust. Written in 1808, Faust is a classic tragedy by German writer and statesman Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. The main protagonist in the story, the character Faust, is based on the legend of the 15th century scholar and astrologer Johann Georg Faust. In the story, Faust is highly successful, but is ultimately dissatisfied with his life and is seeking more from it. The strong desire leads him to make a pact with Mephistopheles, who works as an agent for the devil Lucifer. At first, Mephistopheles warns Faust of the choice he has and tells him that the pact would mean selling his soul in exchange for power and unlimited knowledge. This is the story from which the cultural motif of a Faustian bargain or a deal with the devil originates. Without a Faustian spirit to push the limits of what is possible and to always be striving for more with our inventive nature and dangerous sense of dare, we quite possibly never would have achieved all that we have in the civilized world up to this point. Yet the question will always remain: how far is too far? How much is too much? What are we willing to sacrifice before things turn negative? The answer is a matter of subjective opinion. As alluded to earlier, Faust refers to the daring and inventive nature of the Western civilization. There are numerous pertinent examples of this, both traditional and modern, across a variety of disciplines. The artwork Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog was painted by Caspar David Friedrich in 1818 as part of the Romanticism movement. Evidently, the piece elicits the sense of wonder we feel about the unknown. The painting is also seemingly a demonstration of man's relative insignificance when compared directly with the awesome power and magnitude of nature. The artist draws our attention to the solitary figure overlooking a vast landscape. The assumption seems to be that we take on his persona as our own. Perceptive questions that come to mind almost instantaneously are: what is over the horizon? Where to from here? What is next for me? All questions we are bound to ask ourselves regularly in life. But if we lose the sense of wonder, we lose the motivation to chase something or achieve anything. We become static and fixed rather than dynamic and progressing. We have become rather than we are becoming. Of course, there is always a danger in doing things that have never been done before, which is what makes them Faustian in nature. We could fail horribly and must then deal with the potentially devastating impact of this. But on the other hand, we could also succeed and reach new heights never scaled before. Daring to do the unthinkable, daring to push ourselves in everything that we do, is what makes life worth living. The second example of the Faustian spirit comes from the voyages of the Vikings or Norsemen. These people would travel to faraway lands with plans to raid. The dangers that awaited them would often be completely unknown, and yet even still they would continue to brave uncharted waters and foreign territory like the warriors they were, often making plans for expansive trips way beyond the scope of many others. In a poetic sense, what else could it be but the Faustian spirit that coerced them to go on such arduous journeys? Why risk disaster if not in the pursuit of something greater? If not for new land, then for an ideal greater than oneself. Renowned Scottish philosopher, essayist, and historian Thomas Carlyle once described paganism as the consecration of valour, and said it should be venerated and never considered bad to have bravery, as it is the single trait a man needs before all else, because without bravery one would never act or do anything worthwhile. Carlyle also espoused that to the Norsemen all is godlike or God. Hence, nature is the embodiment of God, and all natural things have a sense of metaphysical wonder. The true Norseman is in touch with the forces of nature and embraces them without fear, such as the act of sailing a boat in a wild storm, because to the Norse all things were fated regardless, so to live dangerously was and is most rewarding. The first modern example of the Faustian spirit is possibly the most iconic example of pushing the limits that we have been gifted by history to reflect upon today. One could say it is the last truly Faustian thing that was attempted, and the last time that civilization took it upon itself to act in accordance with the innate feeling that drives us to do more, see more, and be more. As history suggests, mankind didn't necessarily have to land upon the moon for the first time on July 20, 1969. It had no reason as such to do so, other than doing it because it had never been done before. That is the essence of the Faustian spirit, feeling the organic imperative within, and then taking the necessary measures to turn it into a reality, regardless of what the cost may be. The final modern-day example of the Faustian spirit is the SpaceX CEO, Elon Musk. Whatever your opinion of him, it is hard to deny that he possesses the motivation to do the unthinkable and challenges convention with innovation, investment, and invention. SpaceX has plans to send people into space with the goal of them eventually living on other planets. In the current epoch, no one else but Musk springs to mind when it comes to truly embodying the Faustian spirit and attempting to unlock our potential and the potential of the technology we now use. The other side of the coin to this scenario is the considerable danger involved in these ambitious projects. Musk even admits that the continued development of artificial intelligence is a Faustian bargain, and maintains that it ought to be a cause for alarm and caution for us all in the future, especially those aware of transhumanism as a belief system that ultimately desires immortality via the merging of human consciousness with science and technology. Spengler reiterates a sense of the unique spirit in the Decline of the West, stating, "There is one and only one soul, the Faustian, that craves for a style of architecture which drives through walls into the limitless universe of space and makes both the exterior and interior of the building complementary images of one and the same world feeling." Ortega y Gasset says in The Revolt of the Masses, "The European cannot live unless embarked upon some great unifying enterprise. When this is lacking, he becomes degraded, grows slack, his soul is paralyzed." Hence the argument made here is that if a society is lacking in its formative spirit, or has deviated from it, then the society is not actualized and is rather sick. Restoration of a culture requires belief in the culture. Belief in the culture requires knowledge of the culture, and knowledge of the culture requires engagement within it. Unhealthy skepticism, like nihilism, is a chronic atrophy and disease of the whole being, mind, body, and soul. A man only lives if a man has a purpose for living, and believes in something greater than himself. At the root of this Western ontological sense of becoming is a feeling of longing. It is the feeling of longing that urges becoming toward its goal, that motivates the fulfillment and actualizing of every inward possibility. This longing comes into the consciousness more and more clearly as the feeling of constant direction. As the Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset wrote, "Life is a series of collisions with the future. It is not the sum of what we have been, but what we yearn to be." Yet with the feeling of longing comes the feeling of dread also. As all dynamic becoming, the desire for constant progress then moves towards the daunting static sense of having become, the eventual fulfillment of the desire, which then signifies an endpoint in and fulfillment of the cultural life task, as once it has entirely materialized and become, there is nothing more to pursue, and thus nothing left for the culture to live for. This ties in effectively with an explanation of the Western modern liberal apparent obsession with equality. In current times, the modern liberal has a longing for the progression of society toward becoming equal. For the sake of the argument, let us assume that reaching total equality is possible. If we were to achieve it, which would never be in a single lifetime anyhow, we would have become equal, at which point we would have nothing more to pursue. Thus, we may either dread the moment we reach full equality, or can't articulate when that would be, outside of using wispy platitudes, because we don't exactly know and don't like to think about it, because at that endpoint we would have no greater ideal to live for. Hence, it is merely the sense of becoming and progressing toward an outcome of apparent equality that seems most important to the liberal, not the actual attainment of equality. The attainment would signify the end or the death of that idea, and so the assumed death of a liberal's purpose for living. With no purpose, the liberal may descend further into nihilism, as they come to the realization of saying, okay, we're equal, now what? You could say we're at that point in time right now. People in the West have generally been considered equal for decades, and the 21st century is a prosperous period. So, in an attempt to literally keep the dream alive, liberals search for things to get offended by and legitimize possible mental illness in order to create systemic inequalities that either don't exist or barely exist, just to keep the wheels turning toward the subjective utopia on the horizon and further justify the existence of their ideals. The campaign for LGBTQI inclusiveness is exclusionary of religious beliefs, particularly conservative Christianity. This inclusive movement is a religion of sorts, just a godless one. Its followers act like religious zealots in defense of their ideas, which stem from the Enlightenment. The only difference between modern liberal religiosity and traditional theism is that the modern liberal has no deity who will punish you for your sins when you die, just the mob who will punish you for your sins while you're alive. The modern liberal's total rejection of the Christian God also signifies a total rejection of any true affinity with the heritage of Western culture and civilization, because during its period of development and strength, the Western culture was built and maintained with God in mind, often paying direct homage to a creator in its cultural expressions of art form and architecture. As for the Faustian spirit, it's possibly the case that liberal, progressive, world-improving, ought-based thinking is a distorted version of the true spirit. The Faustian spirit is certainly powerful, but neither a good nor bad spirit. It is neither a positive nor negative thing. It just is. The Faustian spirit pertains to the idea of conquering your surroundings and endless expansion into limitless space. Liberals don't want to think about the possible consequences of conquering space. The only scenario within which liberals tend to come close to conceptualizing and perhaps even understanding the Faustian spirit is man-made climate change theory. The Faustian bargain aspect here would be that in order to possibly reduce the damage that man causes to the earth, he would have to invent more and more new technology to keep the wheels in motion, so to speak, thereby stretching the limits further and further until they eventually break anyway. If man-made climate change is legitimate, someone like Oswald Spengler would surely argue that it is a direct consequence of the Faustian spirit. Thus, what led to our growth and development will simultaneously lead to our destruction. Spengler would argue that it is inevitable, can't be avoided, and thus shouldn't be avoided, only braced for in a bravely pessimistic manner, like the last soldier at Pompeii. However, the prospect of anything being inevitable or destined, especially if it is bad, runs counterintuitive to the liberal worldview, because they clearly don't believe that anything is predetermined. In their minds, the only thing that is remotely close to being predetermined is progress to a utopia. But obviously that is not really a deterministic perspective that they have. It's just a perspective of cowardly optimism, built on mere hope and desire, not on any objective facts. Not to mention, the argument could be made that liberalism is so obsessed with world improvement because they are atheistic. According to them, God is dead and we killed him with rationalism. So this world is all they are concerned with, because it's the only realm they believe exists. Yet religion was the thing that calmed the fear of death and the consciousness of the void. It provided meaning and suggested a necessary explanation. Once again, nowadays God is dead in the eyes of the modern world, but the fear of death remains, and is no longer addressed but avoided at all costs. Liberalism has failed to provide any answers to life's deepest questions, failed to provide comfort to the fear of death, whilst that was one of the seminal functions of religion. The only way truly great cultural feats in the West were ever achieved was through strong faith, and thus the conquering of the fear of death. Therefore, religion undoubtedly has a place when confronting this most fundamental of anxieties, and possibly all anxiety. It's obvious that a metaphysic is needed to answer the unanswerable questions. Some may say Christianity made death more frightening for many, with the prospect of going to hell if you've committed certain wrongdoings. But that is surely the premise of the cultural motif of a God-fearing Christian. The consequences of specific sins are bad. So logic would suggest it's sensible to do your utmost to be as virtuous as possible and refrain from the things that you sense to be corrupt and that are commonly agreed upon to be corrupt. Upon completing your life task, what else is there to live for? Hence, the actual completion of the life task would be scary. In truth, the liberal life task will never be completed in our lifetime, and who is to say that future generations will even want to complete it and attain equality, especially if history is viewed in a cyclical manner and not linear. Those who push equality don't seem to realize that the conclusion of their goal is not tangible. They cannot articulate a clear moment in time when we will be suddenly equal and everything will work out. Part of this is because, by being Western, they have rejected the objective boundaries of classical thought. Because of its concern with the objective, classical thought would provide them with concrete and rigid answers. But since they have rejected the idea of there being rigid answers to any questions, they can't even answer the basic question to clarify the exact point of equality, to clarify the attainment of their own goal, because that would require a definite response. It is not even a goal in the first place if it is not specific. So what they are pushing for is the fulfillment of a desire at best and a delusion at worst. They don't know what they want other than not what they have now, which is a hallmark of destructive rather than constructive criticism, akin to kicking and screaming rather than rational discussion. Because of the dynamic Faustian spirit, Spengler asserts that the history of Western knowledge is thus one of progressive emancipation from classical thought, as mentioned earlier. Classical thought pertaining to Greco-Roman culture and the strict and rigid rationality that underpinned it, using dialectics to describe the differences between Western and classical culture. Spengler thus described the classical culture as static or become, and the Western culture as dynamic or becoming. As per Spenglerian doctrine, to have become is to have reached a point of causal necessity, an endpoint of total fulfillment akin to death, whilst becoming is akin to life and the pursuit of a destiny. Modern mathematics is now considered a universal doctrine, but in Volume 1 of his 1926 magnum opus Decline of the West, Spengler demonstrates that this wasn't always the case. Each culture developed its own methods and theories, which were exclusively its own. The structure of the mathematics and scientific way of thinking used by a culture would reflect the character, geography, or philosophy of that culture. Every product of the waking consciousness of the classical world, then, is elevated to the rank of actuality by way of sculptural definition. Simply put, in the classical culture, that which cannot be drawn is not number. The Greek mathematic, as a science of perceivable magnitudes, deliberately confined itself to facts of the comprehensively present and limited its researches and their validity to the near and the small. The Greek mathematic was impeccably consistent. Classical number was a thought process dealing not with spatial relations. As per Spengler, classical mathematics and physics did not know the content of the word space, but with a visibly limitable and tangible unit or units. And it follows naturally and necessarily that the classical knew only the natural, i.e., positive and whole numbers. The proposition of the classical mathematic was that number is the essence of all things perceptible to the senses, things that have become. Thus, the idea of irrational numbers, the abstract unending decimal fractions of the Western system, and the Indian concept of zero, for example, were inconceivable for the classical culture. The Greek system was rigid and finite, as was their character as well. The Western system of numbers is romantic in that it is chronological, sequential, and constantly progressing, as demonstrated by infinitesimal calculus, which is the mathematical study of continuous change. Generally, modern calculus is considered to have been developed in the 17th century. Therefore, it stands to reason that a study of continuous change is developed by a culture who has an unrestrained, strong-willed, far-ranging soul, and a fascination with challenging perceptions and exploring the unthinkable. Our universe of infinite space, whose existence for us goes without saying, simply did not exist for classical man. Conversely, the Hellenic cosmos, which is entirely foreign to our way of thinking, was for the Greeks something self-evident. Spengler said that the infinite space of Western physics is a form of very numerous and extremely complicated elements tacitly assumed, which have come into being only as the copy and expression of our Western soul, and are actual, necessary, and natural only for our type of waking life. The premise of infinite space is evidently comparable to perpetual motion, a state in which movement or action is or appears to be continuous and unceasing. Upon seeking to attain perpetual motion, Faustian man is primarily concerned with the science of dynamics, the idea of force moving mass, Newton's laws of motion. As stated earlier, calculus is the mathematical study of continuous change, the measurement of changes in the motion of bodies through space. Thus, calculus is the language of the science of dynamics. Faustian civilization differs from all other civilizations because the machine is its dominant fascination, and thus it uses the machine as a driving force behind its insatiable desire to harness or even subjugate nature, subjecting nature to the power of its will and ultimately becoming an apex predator, or attempting to reach a state of godhood and becoming the measure of all things, just as Protagoras asserted. It appears in the 21st century that the Western world has advanced technologically to levels unforeseen. However, such is the tragedy of the tale of Faust that a civilization fitting this exact description may well suffer the same fate. Perpetual motion is considered hypothetical and ultimately impossible, as it challenges and violates commonly agreed upon laws of thermodynamics, laws pertaining to the relationship between heat and other forms of energy, and by extension the relationship between all forms of energy. These laws of thermodynamics apply regardless of the size of the system. For example, the motions and rotations of celestial bodies such as planets may appear perpetual, but are subject to many processes that slowly dissipate their kinetic or dynamic energy, such as solar, wind, gravitational radiation, and thermal radiation. So basically, they will not keep moving forever. Motion without a source of energy is impossible. Thus, machines that extract energy from finite sources will not operate indefinitely, because they are driven by the energy stored in the source, which will eventually be exhausted. A common example is devices powered by ocean currents, whose energy is ultimately derived from the sun, which itself will eventually burn out. Machines powered by more obscure sources have been proposed, but are subject to the same inescapable laws, and will eventually wind down. Just as a machine extracts energy from finite sources, so too does Western civilization extract from the planet it inhabits. But if it didn't do that, the Western world would never have reached the levels of advancement that it has. Levels of advancement that we have all taken for granted. Here again lies the tragedy of the Faustian bargain. The suggestion that Western civilization is Promethean in nature is also rather profound and possibly accurate. As in Greek mythology, Prometheus was a titan, cultural hero, and trickster who defied the gods by stealing fire and giving it to humanity, an act that enabled progress and civilization. By doing so, Prometheus clearly considers himself the measure of all things. However, for this trickery and arrogant act of defiance, Prometheus was swiftly punished by the gods and sentenced to eternal torment for his transgression. The gods thereby demonstrate that while Prometheus, or man, may be the measure of all things, because he foolishly dabbled with forces far beyond his comprehension, he is in no way the master of all things, and may well be subject to the will of the gods, or in another sense, subject to the organic revenge of nature against him. There is a lesson here about unintended consequences, the risk of overreaching, and the resultant tragedy that could come from endless expansion or endless societal progression. As such, Western man's greatest strength, the desire to push for the infinite, is also his greatest weakness, as it may lead to his downfall, very much like a double-edged sword. Technology has no doubt forced man to abstract and to a degree neglect the body and spirit, as it demands only the intellectual and rational conscious mind to operate. Technology makes him independent from nature and grants him freedom, but only freedom of the mind, so only freedom in really 1/3 of his entire being, only to become dependent upon technology instead of dependent upon nature. If one gets caught up in technology too much, there is a risk of becoming a cog in the machine. Then even technology loses its initial novelty and wonder until it traps you as the apparent only thing that matters in life. The cycle of man is from savage nature man to intrigued, naive, spiritual man to refined culture man to rational tech man and eventually man-tech, as the subject and object swap around. Indistinguishable between technology and man, but eventually more technology than man. Transhuman. Even now, who is reliant on whom? Initially, technology was just tools to help us. Now it seems the opposite. The technology dictates to and controls man, rather than man dictating to and controlling the technology. We shape ourselves around the technology and can no longer live without it. Spengler wrote, "The simple notions are always the most difficult. They are simple in that they comprise a vast deal that not only is incapable of being exhibited in words, but does not even need to be stated, because for men of the particular group, it is anchored in the intuition. And these simple notions are difficult because, for all alien men, their real content is, ipso facto, quite inaccessible. Such a notion that is simultaneously simple and difficult is the Western meaning of the word space, which, as mentioned earlier, the classical man could not fathom. The discipline of mathematics as we know it today is merely an amalgamation of all previous forms of mathematic. So, just as there are subjective concepts of morality, there were originally subjective concepts of number. Another specific critique from Spengler is of the premise of world history, once again suggesting that viewing history as universal is a fundamental error. Many modern historians appear to fall into a trap and bias of describing Western history as world history. An explanation for such a sweeping statement appears to be because the West is currently the dominant hegemony of the world. The 18th and 19th centuries were an enormously productive period for Europe, and thus it is known as the Age of Enlightenment. However, for a Chinese historian, that period in Chinese history was comparatively uneventful and insignificant compared to their dominant epoch of the Han dynasty, which ran for over 400 years, from 206 BC to 220 AD, and is sometimes called the Golden Age of ancient China. Western history is Western history, not world history. If the West were to lose its hegemonic status in world affairs and gradually be phased out, it is highly doubtful that non-Westerners would carry on and continue living to Western principles and standards. They would live to the principles and standards of their own cultures, not to a culture that would be somewhat alien to them and virtually moribund anyway. Thus, the legacy of Western history may well be cast to the wind and forgotten, or just completely altered to present less successful cultures in a more positive light. Irish poet and playwright Oscar Wilde's 19th century Gothic and philosophical novel The Picture of Dorian Gray could quite easily be viewed as a metaphor for Western culture and civilization. There is a clear Faustian bargain theme. Dorian starts out vibrant, beautiful, and powerful, but gradually descends into corruption. However, unlike Faust, Dorian sells his soul not for knowledge, but for eternal youth. Thus, the devil in this instance is vanity, hubris, and narcissism. Take nothing more than a cursory glance at the modern world now, especially through the medium of social media and technology. It is self-evident that we are Faust. We are Dorian Gray. And attention is our universal currency. The more attention you can garner, the more benefit you receive. Beauty can rule the world, as it always has done, but is empty if there is no soul. Form without substance is frail. Perhaps there will come a time when attempts at resuscitation are futile. However, one can hope that that time is not today. When we assess the Faustian spirit pertaining to climate change, 100% renewable energy is not a logical solution. Not unless something new is invented that can sustain power substantially. Perhaps we make solar more affordable, higher quality, and make the parts reusable. But what happens when the sun goes down and there's no wind for the wind turbines to turn? All in all, possible pragmatic changes start in the home, such as reducing plastic usage and reducing plastic on our beaches and in our oceans. Meanwhile, that much anticipated invention would be the innovation that the West needs to keep the world economy from eventually falling off a cliff in the end. Anyway, given its current trajectory as an artificially inflated bubble. People blame the expansive patterns of capitalism for the relentless growth that got our civilization into this climate change fiasco, but they don't realize that given the nature of the broken, artificially inflated and manipulated economic system, the only way to get out of the problem is to develop new innovative technology, thereby expanding and growing even more. It's just the Faustian bargain, and the West will probably damage itself irreparably with its endless expansion. But this must happen to live and survive right now. It's a paradox. Extraordinary growth got us into the problem, but only extraordinary growth will get us out, until we eventually exhaust all resources in the pursuit of perpetual motion, and perpetual motion is impossible. Protesters may say we've got to first declare a climate emergency and then we'll work out how to deal with it later. But there is no genuine pragmatic plan. It's guaranteed that the logical conclusion of their solution would be to tear down civilization and live in stateless wasteland, otherwise known as the communist anarchist ideal utopia, only based on the philosophical ideal that man is apparently inherently good or ought to be good and doesn't need civilization to exist peacefully. This is known as the noble savage argument. When utopian ideals have always led to brutal wars or survival of the fittest scenarios. Therefore, it's hard to separate the environmental science from the political motivation. Then there's the modern liberal solution of just building more technology, but as explained, that would lead to inevitable eventual destruction due to perpetual motion and constant growth being impossible. It is a lose-lose scenario, because we are the Faustian civilization, whose underlying cultural world feeling is to push past invisible boundaries and be limitless. This world feeling is what led to our success as a culture, and is what will most likely lead to our downfall as a culture, because our energy will burn out, and so will the energy of the planet at some stage, as we try to create a heaven on earth. Once again, it's thermodynamics. Energy as a physical resource is finite. The same can be said for cultural and spiritual energy. In some sense, if it's going to happen, it's going to be inevitable and something impossible to avoid.